Hi, and welcome to Workshop 5, my favourite one on power. Here is my acknowledgement of country for this week, which is just to share the Warburton football team. I remember my dad being very proud of getting those jumpers donated. They were made of wool and they did play in 40-degree heat, but never mind that. They also used to play in bare feet, and you can see how rocky the ground is, although those lines on the ground are to show the lanes for the running. Not really sure how this relates to power, except for the whole colonial project. And I also think that Aboriginal people are one of the first ways in which they got some legitimacy and power within white society in Australia was through playing football. So some of those football players have been leaders in raising the profile of Aboriginal people in WA. Okay, workshop 5 is about power. I love this quote by Stuart Clegg, which says that to the extent that meaning becomes fixed or reified, made in reality in certain forms, which then articulate particular practices and behaviors, agents, relationships, then this fixity is power. It's the stuckness of it. So power is everywhere. We use power every day to change the world, to go about our daily lives. Power can also maintain the status quo, which isn't good if you want to transition to a more sustainable world. But if we have a more thorough understanding of power theory, then this is going to raise our own agency, or be aware of our own agency, and structures and reifications and subjectification, which all these words we will learn. We can use them for our good purpose, and that's the point of today, is to be able to think in a way that enables us to act and find our own power. So basically, power is everywhere. We're going to talk about the difference between resources and exercises of power, legitimization of power, the fact that power is relational, and the four-dimensional power framework, which is the topic of this first video. You know more about power than you think. Don't go away from this so confused that you think that you don't know anything about power anymore. People instinctively know who's got power, resources, who's exercising power, maybe in an ethical or an unethical way, in a legal and illegal way. But once we can label these uses of power, we can have more agency ourselves. So in class, we did a free write on a time that we felt powerless. And then as we went through reflecting on how what we're learning in terms of the theory here relates to your work, your situation, and help you understand why you felt so powerless and whether there were resources of power that you didn't use that you could have used. Think about what was stopping you, and was there any misuse of power or injustices? Okay, so here's the important part, the 4D dimensional power framework. Fleming and Spicer is one of our key authors here. They say power is inescapable in organizations. It is literally everywhere. And they have done their research from an organizational point of view. We also talk about Haugaard's sociology viewpoint. So he's a sociologist, and he has basically come up with a very similar four-dimensional structure of power. And these four dimensions are quite well accepted in the recent power literature. When I say recent, I'm talking the last 30, 40 years. They have theoretical roots, and they were sort of discovered, if you like, or discussed one at a time. Somebody didn't just say, oh, there's 4 dimensions of power. It came about slowly. So Dahl was the first concept of power, and you've probably heard this idea. I think I read it in a management textbook once. A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. So Dahl was actually talking about this idea of what is power, and he started this idea of power is defined in terms of a relationship between people. It's not a thing that people can own or anything like that. So he's saying people have more or less power, and they have power to direct or influence or coerce people. Anyway, it's a good paper. You can have a read of it. It's interesting to read through what people were thinking. What's this, 1957, so that's 70 years ago, and then as we go through. But this is first dimensional power. And 5 years later, Barak and Baratz published this well-known paper about 2 phases of power, so 2 different sorts of power. They said, yes, what Dahl said is power, what we might call agency, but there's also structural power, and this is the power. It's not as obvious. It comes from our assumptions. It comes from rules and structures, and it comes from controlling what we're allowed to talk about, and agendas and bias and things like that. So this second dimension of power I call structure, and it is about structure in terms of like legal structure, organizational structures, but also societal structures and norms. You can read through that. Stephen Lukes came along in 1974, so some years later, and he wrote a book called A Radical View, where he took Dahl's interpretation of agency, Barak and Baratt's interpretation of structure, and he said, hang on, there's another one. And this is, I forget what he called it, but we would call it now social construction of reality, which we talked about in week 2, actually. So it's ideological power, non-decision making power. It's how we create the world and make the world seem real and natural. The 4th dimension of power is termed subjectification, and that's a really long word, but what it really is, it's really to do with our identity and how we create our own identity, both through our own free will, but also through what society expects us to be. So this was some years later. Michel Foucault is a very famous writer on power, and the ideas for Dimension 4 come up greatly from his work. Subjectification, and I'll let you read all that. These are the 2 papers, and I recommend that you read them. Mark Haugaard's 4 Dimensions of Power, and I've sort of summarized, he hasn't got a table, but I've sort of summarized them here. Dimension 1, agency. Dimension 2, structure, reality, and reification. Reification just means making real into reality. And dimension 4, the social construction of social subjects, subjectification. And Fleming and Spicer, who are the organizational theorists, they have a lovely table in their paper. So this is from an organizational point of view, so it's slightly different wording. I don't like this one as much because what they call the faces of power are all negative words, and I don't think that power is inherently a negative thing. Power is power. It's not negative or positive. So I prefer the other ones, which are value neutral. But if you find these easier to use, you can use these. So they talk about dimension 1, coercion or agency, the direct mobilization of power. Dimension 2, manipulation, attempts to ensure that action and discussion occur within accepted boundaries. Dimension 3, domination or social construction of reality, attempts to make relations of power appear inevitable and natural. And Dimension 4, subjectification, attempts to shape a sense of self, experiences, and emotions. So here's the table that I had at the beginning again, but I've also put some of the subcategories down in here, and we're going to talk about these more in the next 4 short videos. I'll do each one on each dimension. But that's a useful slide to keep in mind. Okay, there are other models of power out there. None are as good as this one, and I don't want you to use them in this unit. I want you to practice using that one. There's an AI one that keeps coming up in people's work when they don't refer to the materials in the unit. There's probably one that comes from other units, I don't know. None of them cover all the dimensions in the way that this one does. Okay, this is a useful one that is more than 100 years old, this one, from Mary Parker Follett, who was an American management consultant and a philosopher. So most workplaces around the turn of the century, between 1800 and 1900, they worked with a power over type of philosophy, and she worked with labor unions and whatnot to negotiate more power with and power to achieve things together. It's a nice idea, and I like the progression to less coercion. However, what I see is that most of the time we think about we've got power to do something together, and we've got power together to do this thing. However, as soon as anything goes wrong or the boss doesn't like which way things are going, they have the option to revert back to power over. And unless you don't have that, unless that's explicitly not allowed, then this is only a way of acting. It's not a theory of power. This is the one that comes along at me quite often, which I do not want you to use, because if you have a look through them, and I'm not going to do it now, but if you look at each one, it talks about things that are all mostly dimension 1. So it is not it's not a full set of resources of power, because it's only dimension 1 power. And if you notice the date that it was contrived, which was 1959, we're talking just after Dahl did his first dimension of power. So it's very old, it's out of date, it's only dimension 1. More than that, it calls authority legitimate power, and that is another social construction. So it's only legitimate because we say it's legitimate, which is a problem for me. Anyway, don't use this. It's a big no.